In the first of a new series looking at the weirdest and most bizarre toys ever committed to plastic, I'm going to be taking aim at ToyBiz, and specifically the Marvel toys during the 1990s. Now, I've often praised ToyBiz, and I have a lot of love and affection for this toy company because they produced, in my opinion, some of the best Marvel toys in my collection growing up. They were constantly taking risks and they weren't afraid to try new things, and out of this came things like our Marvel Legends line, which is still going strong today, 20 years after it first debuted. And they weren't afraid to break away from formula, trying toys at all sorts of different scales and building incredible playsets and vehicles for them to roam about in. But with the greatest will in the world, when you do experiment, when you do take a few risks, sometimes you're going to drop the ball and make a few mistakes along the way. And that today is what I'm going to be taking a look at. So at the top of my list I have Aunt May, and this will probably come as a little surprise to anyone who's ever seen this figure or is just aware of the Marvel Famous Covers line, because this figure has become slightly infamous in fan circles. But for those who aren't aware, in the late 1990s, ToyBiz experimented with the Mego style of action figure, except they increased the scale up to 9 inches, and they radically improved articulation and the body molds. This was quite a successful line for ToyBiz, producing quite a lot of figures across multiple waves, and they soon hit on the idea of having a mail-away exclusive, the result of which was Aunt May. Now, there's so many things wrong with this figure, it's very difficult to know where to start, but the first one I would say is, well, Aunt May, the fact that they chose this character. I can totally understand why they would want someone from Spider-Man's universe, since he was probably the flagship character of the Marvel universe, that you'd want one of those characters to be the mail-away exclusive, get a lot of interest. And I think the idea of fleshing out Peter Parker's world is not a bad idea. But if you're going to do a civilian character, then surely a character like Mary Jane or Gwen Stacy is going to have a lot broader appeal and it's going to be a lot more fun as a toy. Now, the inspiration for this figure comes from the cover of Amazing Spider-Man 115. But honestly, when you look at this cover, wouldn't you rather they went with Dr. Octopus? Okay, so moving on to the figure itself, yeah, things don't get any better. In fact, they get a whole lot worse. The costume and the combination of colours is quite garish, I've got to say. We have that fluorescent magenta woolly cardigan that she seems to be wearing, over which she has that bright pink apron, which is then set off against those thick grey tights, and of course, once again, those bright fuchsia coloured slippers. Just as a colour palette, this is just not very attractive, and it has the effect of just smacking you in the face every time you look at it. And speaking of being smacked in the face, here is the coup de grace, the head sculpt itself. For starters, the head's too small for the body, so it has the effect where Aunt May's hands are massively out of proportion, they look far too large, and as a result, it just looks like poor old Aunt May's head has been stuck on the body of a bodybuilder. And as if that wasn't bad enough, just look at the sculpt, just look at the face on this figure. They have opted to give her the real hair. Now, there's nothing intrinsically wrong with that, I think it works quite well for some of the figures in this series, but here, it only helps to emphasise the high forehead and the pinched, creepy features of the face. And it's really hard to tell with this face whether Aunt May is smiling, if she's startled, has she been surprised, is she angry, is she evil, is she possessed, because that downward smile is a little bit disturbing. And it's really not helped by the paint apps at all, because those eyes look far too pale and piercing. And yeah, overall, this just looks like zombie Aunt May to me. So overall, I think this is well intentioned. It was certainly experimental, but I think it was ultimately misjudged and poorly executed. In the 90s, the X-Men were absolutely huge, and of course ToyBiz were very keen to exploit this. They produced figures of virtually every X-Man you could think of, and made sure that they had plenty of vehicles and playsets to fight in. But once you've exhausted your entire roster of X-Men and villains, and you've gone through all their variant costumes that are from the comic books and cartoons, what do you do next? Well, this is where toy companies start to get creative. And so ToyBiz created a line dedicated to the Savage Land. And I'm sure that this was due in no small part to the success of the Jurassic Park films at the time. But the idea for this line was to create a series of deluxe sets that had a new variant X-Man figure alongside a dinosaur. Now, in some cases, this works quite well. I can think of, obviously, Kazar with Zabu is a really nice addition, it makes perfect sense, and it looks pretty good. But then we have this Wolverine figure. This is a Savage Wolverine in the Savage Land. Now, during the 90s, Wolverine did undergo a bit of a transformation where he was sort of regressed to an almost Neanderthalic state for a brief time in the comic books. I think that this is what that was taking inspiration from, but however, looking back on this figure today, this looks pretty atrocious. This looks barely recognisable as Wolverine if he wasn't wearing his colours, and I think they've gone a little bit too far in making that leap here with this character, because the proportions of the figure look all wrong, the face sculpt is completely off kilter, and the result is a cartoonish, monstrous version of Wolverine that I can't imagine many kids would have wanted in their collection. Okay then, so sticking with the X-Men, as we've seen, ToyBiz's would like to experiment with different genres with their X-Men lines, and sometimes this works perfectly well. Sending the X-Men into space makes sense. Sending them off to the Savage Land? Sure, why not? Sending them off to Japan to be ninjas? Not so much. Now don't get me wrong, I do know that some of the X-Men have strong ties to ninja lore, and that works perfectly fine when we're looking at figures like Wolverine or Psylocke here. And whilst the Wolverine looks a little bit ropey in terms of the sculpt they've gone for, the costume at least makes sense. We know that Wolverine spent time training as a ninja. This works perfectly fine. But things start to become a little bit more confusing when we throw characters like Sabretooth, Deathbird, and Nemesis in there. What do any of these characters have to do with ninjas? I don't believe I've ever read an X-Men story or seen an episode of the animated series where they went to Japan and had battles with the X-Men dressed up as ninjas. This is kind of bizarre with very little explanation, and I think if they just handpicked other characters, this might have worked quite well. Maybe they'd throw in a hand ninja in there, or Lady Deathstrike, or any character really that has an association with Japan or the ninjas. And what's particularly strange is that with characters like Deathbird, they don't even give her any equipment or extra paraphernalia that makes her look like a ninja. It is basically just a repackaged Deathbird figure, so I'm not quite sure what the point of this is. And the odd thing is, they didn't stop there, because they also had a 10-inch line of action figures. Now, these figures were usually upscaled versions of the smaller 5-inch scale. However, they inexplicably released ninja versions of Rogue and Iceman. Rogue at least looks the part, Iceman just looks ridiculous. Not a hoax, not an imaginary tale. This is the Spider-Man Vampire Wars, where, as we can see here, Spider-Man has been literally transformed into a vampire. This is another example where ToyBiz were crossing genres, looking for themes for new lines. And in all seriousness, vampires maybe isn't as ludicrous a theme as you may first think when we think of Spider-Man, because Spider-Man does have some ties to vampires. Obviously, Morbius, the living vampire, debuted in Amazing Spider-Man. Spider-Man's gone on to have many team-ups with Blade the Vampire Hunter, and even in the animated series there was an arc of several episodes that dealt with vampirism. And let's not forget that at the end of the 90s, Marvel had its first cinematic hit with Blade, so it makes sense that they try and capitalise on that. The only problem is that it doesn't really seem to have translated well into toy form. We did get a couple of cool figures in the line. We did get a comic book accurate Blade, which is kind of cool, and we did of course get this monsterized version of Morbius. But it really falls down when it comes to the Spider-Man variants, because first of all we have this anti-vampire Spider-Man, which for all intents and purposes could be any figure, it just has a Spider-Man head on it. It loses the key thing that makes Spider-Man Spider-Man, the fact that he has to rely on all these extra weapons and a completely different costume, takes away from what Spider-Man is. And then clearly the costume isn't that effective, because the next figure we have is the Vampire Spider-Man, so I'm guessing the vampires got him and got through that costume after all. And this is just bizarre. I've got to be honest, I've been left scratching my head trying to understand the thinking behind this one. Having your hero turned into a vampire, and a pretty monstrous vampire at that, it doesn't seem kid-friendly, and I gotta be honest, I can't imagine there's many fans out there who have been longing to see this change in their hero. So, yeah, a strange choice. So before we leave Spider-Man, there's another line I'd like to draw your attention to, and that is the Techno Wars. Once again, what we're seeing here, of course, is a marketing team outlining what is popular with children, and in particular boys' toys, and they're putting key terms together and making entire lines around them. So obviously we have the word wars once again, and this time techno to go along with it. Why is Spider-Man involved in so many wars? I've no idea. But on the face of it, the Techno Wars line isn't necessarily a bad idea. Spider-Man has lots of villains in his rogues gallery who utilise various bits of technology that could have been very after this line. We could have seen Spider Slayers, for example. But no, instead they opted to create a line with multiple Spider-Man that simply had lots of extra bits and pieces, missile launchers and things he could strap on his back, which once again is kind of missing the point of Spider-Man. He doesn't need elaborate equipment for things like this. He uses his web, he swings around, he's got superhuman strength. He doesn't need a good missile launcher to sort his problems out. And it's worth noting there's a couple of characters in here that works perfectly well in this line. We do have the Vault Guardsman, which is pretty cool. This looks pretty decent. And then we have Doc Ock. Now, it's not my preferred costume for Doc Ock, but this kind of works. It's a little bit over the top. It's a little bit inventive. But I still think it works within the realms of what the character is about. I don't think Doc Ock is above building himself a suit of armour to fight Spider-Man. That seems like the kind of thing he might do. And for the most part with this line, I think you have to say, okay, fair enough, they're trying to sell more Spider-Man toys. What else are they going to do to make him more exciting to the child who's already got 3 or 4? But I think we have to draw the line somewhere, and for me, that line is around the radioactive spider armour. Yes, Spider-Man not only has armour, but it's to protect him from radioactivity. It seems kind of strange. Again, seems to fly in the face of Spider-Man, since Spider-Man does obviously have irradiated blood. He owes everything he has to a radioactive spider. If anything, he's the radioactive Spider-Man. I don't think he needs armour for it. This costume bears no resemblance to anything Spider-Man has ever worn, and then to top it off, he's got all these extra contraptions that build on top of that armour, like giant grappling arms. It's at this point, you know, they've gone too far and jumped the shark. And to compound matters, they even released a 10-inch version of Spider-Man, this time in his war armour, and he even has translucent plastic for his thighs. Nothing about this makes sense, so I'm not even going to try to explain it. Now, speaking of armour, there's one character who's very well suited to having variants based on all sorts of different wild armour designs, and that of course is Iron Man. Now, you'd think a toy company like ToyBiz's would be spoiled for choice for the various armours that Iron Man has displayed across the years, that they would never need to really resort to going off-piste and creating their own strange ensemble, but sadly, they did. As the line started to wane, they started to get a bit more creative with the kind of Iron Man costumes they could produce for Tony Stark, and so they came up with this samurai Iron Man. Now, don't get me wrong, for all intents and purposes, this is quite a nice looking figure, but my issue with it really comes from the fact that most of Iron Man's armour is steeped in a practical necessity. So if Iron Man's going underwater or into outer space, then the costume is going to reflect that, and it makes a kind of sense. It has a kind of logic to it. But samurai Iron Man? I do not know why Iron Man needs a costume that resembles a samurai costume. I don't understand why he needs all these blades. It doesn't really make a lot of sense. Even if he was going into war to fight a samurai army, certainly the Iron Man costume would be more than enough to fight. So I don't quite understand what's going on here. And then at the other furthest extreme, we have the Tony Stark Armor Iron Man. And this is basically Iron Man in his PJs with his briefcase and a couple of pieces of the Iron Man armor. And again, on the face of it, this kind of makes sense. It'd be nice to have a Tony Stark figure. He's obviously the alter ego of Iron Man, so that makes a lot of sense. But the trouble is that he's in this in-between stage where he's neither one thing nor the other. And if you want to make him more Iron Man, well, you're kind of always going to be missing his torso and all the other bits of armor that make him Iron Man. So he always looks incomplete, unfinished, and a bit silly, whatever you do with him. And to make matters worse, they actually promoted this version into a 10-inch scale figure as well. Now, ToyBiz's liked their armor lines, and I could probably fill out a top 10 just on some of these ludicrous designs that we see where they're just utterly inappropriate and make no sense. And for some reason, probably popularity, Wolverine was one of the biggest victims for this kind of thinking. This Missile Flyers line is a particularly good example. Here we have what appears to be a Logan head stitched onto the body of Onslaught and then painted in Wolverine colours. No idea what this is about. This is set in the future and that's about all we know. So at some point we can extrapolate that for some reason Wolverine decides to don the armour of Onslaught. But then look at this example of future apocalypse. What the hell am I even looking at? This bears no resemblance to Apocalypse on virtually any level. But alas, even this is not the most egregious example of armor mania gone too far. No, I reserve that place for the Monster Armor line. Now, to be fair, pretty much every figure in this lineup is awful. The entire concept is absolutely abysmal and just smacks of scraping the barrel. I guess the idea here was to take two popular concepts and meld them together, so monsters and armour, and even though it makes absolutely zero sense, they still went ahead. And whilst the armour pieces are optional, and some of these figures aren't bad, the Cyclops, for example, without the armour pieces, looks pretty decent, poor Wolverine suffers once again, because even without the armour pieces, this isn't a good toy. So where do you go once you've hit rock bottom, when you've plumbed the lowest depths when it comes to armour? Well, you go to Mega Armor. Same awful idea, but just done on a much bigger scale. Needless to say, this was rolled out through their most successful and popular characters, the XMen, Spiderman, and what you have is essentially a straight re-release or maybe a slight tweaked variant of a popular figure put inside some giant mech armor. Maybe this was taking the cue from Power Rangers and it was trying to compete, but honestly, these characters don't need to compete. And this is often the problem with unimaginative toy lines, when they run out of steam and they try to force that square peg in the round hole. Rather than playing to the strengths of the character, making it feel naturalistic, they'll force vehicles where vehicles aren't necessary. Spider-Man doesn't need a spider car. But there's absolutely nothing wrong with giving Captain America or Wolverine a bike. It's about being appropriate and about being logical. And also giving your audience, giving kids some credit, because even as a child, I knew this was a lame idea. I hated stuff like this. What I wanted was the core character, and I wanted my action figures to stay true to the spirit of what I was seeing on TV, what I was reading in comic books. I didn't like all this outlandish stuff that didn't make any sense. As great as the toy might be functionally, it didn't feel authentic and therefore seemed really bad. And by this point, I think even the toys themselves were feeling it. Look at Wolverine's expression here. He looks like his brain's been melted out through his head. And then we come to the Shapeshifters. Now, I'm sure you know from this image where I'm going with this, and if you haven't, well, you're in for a laugh. Here we see ToyBiz continuing the trend to borrow from other popular toys, in this case Transformers, and of course melding them with Marvel characters. So you get an action figure of your favourite hero or villain on the one hand, but a few clicks, a few twists and turns, and it's suddenly something completely different. Now, I gotta be honest, this doesn't work for me and it never did as a kid. I think Transformers are great, but they are their own thing really, and I don't think it translates to superheroes. They seem to make absolutely tons of them though, so I'm guessing they sold well. But looking at these things, I can't tell you why. Some of them would turn into things that resembled or related to their character. So the rhino transforms into a rhino. Okay, that kind of makes sense. And the lizard turns into, well, a kind of crocodile. Okay, again, I'll give you that. That kind of works. Doesn't work quite as well, however, when Wolverine transforms into a bench. Or whatever the hell the Hulk is meant to be. And Carnage, I give up. And I can't say that I've ever held any secret desire to see Thor transform into Pegasus. But the all-time worst, the very infamous Punisher. Mainly because he's so unintentionally funny. It's amazing how this got through the quality control. No one raised an eyebrow thinking that maybe this wouldn't be appropriate on a child's toy. But even looking past that, what the hell is this supposed to be once it's fully transformed? Nothing about this works at all. It is a complete disaster. So which toy line from ToyBiz gets top spot for my ire? Well, it's none other than the Spider-Man Adventure Hero line. For me, this 10-inch action figure line represents the very nadir, the absolute bottom of the barrel. It feels very much like Hasbro throwing up their hands and giving up by this point. This line consists only of Spider-Man, and the entire concept revolves around re-releasing the same Spider-Man figure that has been released many times before, and then simply put him in a different outfit, usually a cloth outfit that has absolutely nothing to do with Spider-Man, with comics, with superheroes, or adventure. Most of these outfits are so humdrum and ordinary and completely divorced from any link with Spider-Man and his world. Instead, we have a Spider-Man who wants to practice jiu-jitsu. We have a Spider-Man who wants to put on a heavy parka and go visit the North Pole. We have a Spider-Man who wants to go on safari. A Spider-Man who wants to play soccer. And beside the fact that this is just plain boring, the worst thing about this line is the fact that it completely flies in the face of what Spider-Man is about. It completely disrespects the character. Spider-Man doesn't need to go bungee jumping or skydiving. He's got webs. He swings around the city. He's been to outer space. He doesn't need to go on safari. He doesn't need to put on an outfit on top of his outfit. If he wants to do these things incognito, he could do them as Peter Parker. Why does he wear his mask and then put on a heavy parka on top of it? None of it makes sense. And it just seems like the most tired, most boring, most lame idea that ToyBiz has ever come up with. Anyway, enough said. As ever, in the comments, please do let me know your thoughts. Let me know if I missed anything, if there's any particular horrors that you played with growing up that you think deserves to be on this list. I'd be absolutely fascinated to hear it. If you enjoyed this video, please do give it a like and remember to subscribe as there'll be plenty more videos soon.